She woke up face down in dirt. Her mouth was full of leaves. Her jacket was soaked in freezing mud. And somewhere far off, she could hear something breathing, slow, heavy, wet. Sierra didn't move. Not yet. Her arms were numb. Her legs weren't responding. Her mind was fogged from the fall. How far had she dropped? 30 feet? 40? Her right side throbbed with pain. Something was broken. Her ribs, maybe. Above her, thin strands of sunlight pierced through the thick canopy. Cold wind crept between the trees, hissing softly like it was mocking her. She blinked slowly, tried to piece it together. The hiking trail, the storm, the edge, the scream. Then, the drop. Panic clawed its way up her throat. She was alone, completely, terrifyingly alone. 2 days ago, she'd been standing on solid ground, smiling, holding a map, telling her friends she'd be fine doing the solo hike. Just a few hours, she'd said. Easy trail. Just need some headspace. And now? She was somewhere at the bottom of a forest ravine, with no food, no signal, and no one even looking for her yet. Her fingers twitched. That was good. She could move. You're not dead. Yet. She turned her head slowly and froze. Just 20 feet away, on the edge of the shadows, stood a black figure, silent, watching, its body low, shoulders hunched, ears perked, eyes gleaming. A wolf? No, not just a wolf. A pack leader. Lone wolves didn't stalk, and this one wasn't alone. A second pair of eyes flashed behind the trees. Her heart pounded in her ears. She forced herself to breathe slow. No sudden moves. She'd read about this. Don't run. Don't show fear. Make yourself look big. But how do you look big when you can't even stand? Sierra reached slowly toward her side, pain screaming through her ribs as she fumbled for anything. Stick, rock, something. Her fingers closed around a shard of splintered wood, barely the size of a dagger. But it was something. The lead wolf growled, low, deep, ancient. Sierra sat up. The world spun, but she held her ground. Back off, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The wolves didn't move. They just watched. Then, just as quickly as they appeared, they were gone, melted into the woods like shadows. She didn't know why they left. Maybe the gods were tired of teasing her. Or maybe they were just waiting for her to bleed a little more. Hours passed. She tried to stand once and collapsed instantly. Her right leg was useless, twisted, possibly fractured. She tore strips of fabric from her backpack and wrapped it as tight as she could. Every movement was a fresh wave of fire across her ribs. There was no trail in sight. No markers, no sound of water, no buzz of planes above, just trees. Endless, ancient trees. She needed shelter. The temperature would drop hard once the sun left, and out here, night was death. Crawling hurt, but she did it anyway, pulling herself with her elbows across damp moss and broken leaves. A fallen log offered cover, half rotted, but enough to break the wind. She stacked what little brush she could find, trying to form a crude wall. Her hands bled, her breath fogged with cold, and then the first snowflakes started to fall. She almost laughed. Snow, of course. She'd come out for clarity, for a few hours of silence, away from the city noise, the people. the noise in her own head. Instead, she was going to die on a forest floor with a broken leg and a pocket full of useless gear. She pulled out her phone again. 1%. Battery. No bars. Should she record a message? What would she even say? Hi, Mom. I messed up. Tell Dad I'm sorry. I should have stayed. I should have listened. No, she wasn't ready for that. Not yet. The night came like a wave. The cold wrapped around her like a vice. Her fingers stiffened. Her lips cracked. Every sound felt closer. Branches breaking. Leaves shifting. Something howling far, far away. She tried to stay awake. She knew if she fell asleep, she might not wake up again. But exhaustion hit harder than fear. Her eyes drifted shut, and in her dreams, she saw herself walking, running, laughing, alive. The next morning, she woke up to silence, except not complete silence. There was water, somewhere nearby, a faint trickling sound carried by the wind. A stream. Adrenaline surged. She rolled onto her stomach and started crawling again. Slow, desperate. Every inch was a war. Every breath a scream. But the sound got louder. And then she saw it. A stream. Clean. Cold. Real. She dipped her fingers in and drank greedily. The cold burned her throat, but it tasted like life. And then she saw the tracks. Boot prints. Fresh. Someone else had been here. She looked up, eyes scanning the trees. Her voice cracked through the woods. Hello. Hey. Hey. No response. But the prints were real. She wasn't alone out here. Not anymore. Sierra's voice echoed through the forest. Hello. Is anyone there? Only silence answered. The stream gurgled softly, winding its way between mossy rocks, indifferent to her desperation. The boot prints at the edge of the bank were clear, fresh, deliberate, human, not the flattened scatter of an animal, not her own. Someone had been here. Hope flared in her chest, a fragile flame after a night of freezing fear. But it was quickly tempered by caution. If someone was close, they hadn't heard her, or they had and chosen not to answer. She stared deeper into the woods. The prints led upstream into a thicker part of the forest where the trees grew closer together, their twisted trunks forming a dark corridor. Fog hung low there, like a warning. Still, she couldn't ignore it. If someone was nearby, it could mean rescue. A hiker, a ranger, even a camper with a radio. She splashed cold water on her face, wiping away the dried blood caked near her eyebrow. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline surging through her body. Her leg still screamed with every movement, but it held weight, just barely. She wrapped the makeshift bandage tighter, tied it off with trembling fingers, and took her first step. Pain exploded in her side. She gasped, nearly collapsed, but she stayed upright. Come on, girl, she whispered through gritted teeth. If you don't walk, you die. Each step was a test of will. The forest seemed to lean in around her, whispering doubts between every gust of wind. Her breath steamed in the cold air. Her arms hugged tight around her chest for warmth. She followed the prints, upstream, into the fog. The forest grew darker, denser. Every branch seemed to claw at her clothes. The prints became harder to follow, sometimes vanishing over dry rocks or dense brush. But they always returned, and with them came signs. An empty protein bar wrapper, A piece of torn orange tape tied to a tree branch. Breadcrumbs. Someone was marking a path. She clung to the hope that whoever it was had left them intentionally, maybe for rescue teams, maybe just to not get lost. But it meant she wasn't entirely alone. After nearly an hour of hobbling, she found it. A fire pit, freshly used. The coals were still warm. She knelt beside it, nearly weeping. Her fingers hovered over the fading heat, soaking in whatever comfort they could. She spotted a water bottle, half full, left lying on its side, a knife embedded in a stump, but no person. "Hello," she called again, quieter this time, as if afraid of disturbing something. The forest held its breath. She picked up the bottle, drank half of it, then forced herself to stop. She didn't know how long she'd need it to last. Her own supplies were long gone, scattered from the fall. Her eyes scanned the tree line. A path, worn, narrow, footprints going both directions. Someone had been staying here, possibly coming back. She debated staying near the pit, building her own fire, waiting, but something about the silence made her uneasy. A gut feeling she couldn't shake. So she kept moving. The fog thickened, wrapping around the trees like smoke. Her visibility dropped. She kept one hand on the trunks as she passed, feeling the wet bark, grounding herself in the real. Then she heard it. A sound. Movement. She froze. A snap. Twigs breaking. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Maybe a dozen feet behind her. She turned, heart slamming into her ribs. Nothing. The forest stood still. She took a shaky breath. "Hello?" Her voice wavered. Still no answer. Maybe she was hallucinating. The cold, the exhaustion. But she could feel it now. Eyes on her. Like prey under a spotlight. She picked up her pace. The sound returned. This time to her left. She spun again. Still nothing. Then a flicker of motion. In the fog. A figure. She stumbled backward, tripped over a root, and landed hard. Her hands scraped against stone as she crawled backward. But the figure stepped forward. A man, middle-aged, rugged clothes, beard, wearing a battered orange vest. He raised both hands slowly, palms out. "You okay?" he asked, voice low and cautious. Sierra didn't answer right away. Her pulse was still in her throat. He crouched a few feet away. "Didn't come closer. Didn't mean to scare you. I heard shouting earlier. Figured you might be hurt." She finally nodded. "I fell. I think my leg's fractured. Been out here since yesterday." He frowned. "You're lucky to be walking. Not many make it through a night like that." She didn't respond. She was still watching him, trying to read him. There was something in his eyes. Concern, yes. But also something else. Something hard to place. He stood, offered a hand. "Name's Reed. Got a camp not far from here. Shelter. Food. You can rest." Her body screamed, yes. Her instincts whispered, no. But she had no other choice. She took his hand and hoped to God she hadn't just made the worst mistake of her life. End of section 2. Cliffhanger. Who is Reed? And is he really here to help? Or something much worse? The walk to Reed's camp felt longer than it should have. Sierra limped beside him, her legs stiff and burning with every step. Reed barely spoke. He moved like someone who knew the forest intimately, ducking low branches, skirting around soft, ground, leaving barely a footprint behind. But he never looked back at her. Not once. She noticed. The trees here grew denser, thicker, almost suffocating. The wind had died completely. All she could hear was the steady crunch of their steps and the distant call of crows overhead. Finally, the trees parted to reveal a crude clearing. Reed's camp was a canvas tarp strung between two trees, sagging in the middle from last night's snow. A fire pit lay cold and blackened at the center. A stack of firewood sat beside it, neatly arranged. There was no tent, no tools, no sleeping bag, just the tarp, and a metal box at the back of the clearing. She slowed. Her instincts screamed again. Reed dropped his bag beside the pit. Have a seat. You need rest. She remained standing. Her eyes flicked to the box. It looked like a storage trunk. Maybe military issue. Old. Scratched. Where's your radio? She asked. He looked up. No signal out here. Never is. Any way to get a message out? Nope. Closest outpost's a 2-day hike. He picked up a piece of kindling and began to stack a new fire. Calm. Too calm. Sierra sat slowly on a nearby rock, her eyes never leaving him. He hadn't offered food or water or asked anything about her injury. She clutched her leg. It throbbed under the wrap. Reed struck a match. The fire crackled to life, thin smoke rising into the still air. How long you been out here? She asked, testing his rhythm. While. Alone? Don't see many folks come this deep. She glanced around. No maps. No compass. Nothing to suggest he ever planned to leave this place. She swallowed hard. What were you doing when you found me? He looked up then. Eyes sharp. Too sharp. I wasn't looking for you. You found me. Silence fell like a stone. Sierra felt the hairs on her neck rise. The fire's warmth suddenly felt like a trap. Reed stood slowly, stretched. I've got some supplies in the trunk, he said. You need painkillers? She hesitated, nodded. Please. He walked to the trunk and knelt beside it. The lid creaked open. She saw it then, just for a second. Not painkillers, not medicine. A coil of rope, a roll of duct tape, a knife, longer than necessary. He didn't take anything out. He just stared into the box. Sierra's pulse pounded in her ears. Her eyes scanned the camp. No weapons, no paths, just dense woods and a man between her and the only way out. He turned slowly. Why don't you rest a bit? You look tired. She forced a smile. Yeah, might be a good idea. He watched her. You trust me? Her mouth was dry. She nodded anyway. He smiled back, but it didn't reach his eyes. Then he walked past her, back toward the fire. The second his back was turned, she moved. She didn't run. She couldn't, but she limped fast toward the trees, deeper into the thickest part of the forest where the fog clung to the undergrowth. Branches whipped at her face. Her legs screamed in protest. She didn't look back. She didn't want to know if he was chasing. She just kept moving. The forest swallowed her whole. 10 minutes passed, maybe 20. Time blurred. She stopped only when her body gave out, collapsing against a tree, gasping for breath. Behind her, only silence. No footsteps, no voice, no sign of Reed. But she knew better. He was following, watching, tracking. She needed a plan. She needed a weapon. She scoured the ground. A thick branch, heavy enough to swing. Not perfect, but it would have to do. She moved again. Slower, now. Smarter. Doubling back, covering her tracks. Every step was deliberate. Every breath controlled. Then, she saw something ahead. A clearing. Not like reeds. This one was older, overgrown, forgotten. In the center stood a collapsed shack, half swallowed by ivy and moss. She approached it cautiously. Inside, it was dark, cold, but safer than open ground. She slipped in, barricaded the doorway with debris, and curled behind a fallen beam. The shadows wrapped around her like a blanket, and for the first time since falling, she cried, not from fear, not from pain, from rage. She had survived the fall, survived the cold. She wasn't going to die at the hands of a man pretending to help. End of section 3. Next, the confrontation, the turning point, and the fight to reclaim control. Sierra's breath was ragged as she huddled behind the makeshift barricade inside the decaying shack. Every inch of her body ached, but it was the fear, the dread that gnawed at her more than the pain. She could feel the weight of the night creeping closer, each moment building the certainty that Reed was still out there, waiting, watching. She reached for the makeshift weapon, the thick branch she had found earlier, and gripped it tightly. Her knuckles ached, but it was the only thing between her and the predator outside. Her pulse hammered in her chest. He knew where she was. No way he didn't. He was waiting for her to make a move. Suddenly, a sound. A snap of a twig. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. She froze, holding her breath. Her heart skipped a beat as the shadows outside her makeshift shelter shifted. Sierra's eyes darted around, searching for something, anything, to use to her advantage. The shack's rotting wood creaked as if in warning, and she pressed herself deeper into the dark corner, hoping the shadows would hide her. And then, there he was. Reed stepped into the clearing outside the shack, the fog swirling around him like a cloak. He stood tall, his eyes scanning the area. Silent, steady. Sierra's grip tightened on the branch. Her instincts screamed that this was it. This was the moment. She could either fight for her life or let him decide how it would end. Her hand trembled, but she forced herself to stay calm. She wasn't giving up now. The confrontation, Reed didn't rush. He moved toward the shack with a deliberate pace, almost as if he enjoyed the chase. His eyes never left the door. He was playing with her. Sierra waited, her body tensed as his shadow passed close to the entrance. One mistake, just one. Reed reached for the door handle. No time left. Sierra lunged with everything she had. She swung the branch with all her remaining strength, aiming for his head. A sharp crack of wood against flesh. Reed staggered back, caught off guard. His eyes flashed with momentary surprise, but only for a second. Sierra wasn't finished. She surged forward, her foot finding a loose stone and sending her crashing into him. The force of the collision knocked them both to the ground. Reed scrambled, but she was quicker, straddling his chest and slamming the branch down again, this time aimed at his neck. The fight for survival, Reed grunted, grabbing her wrist, trying to wrench the branch from her hands. The struggle was brutal, raw. Sierra's entire body screamed in protest, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't give him an inch. With a primal roar, she pushed all her weight onto the branch, forcing it down harder. Reed's grip loosened, just for a second, just long enough for Sierra to drive it home. The branch hit the ground beside his head with a sickening thud. Victory. But it wasn't over. Reed, bloodied but not defeated, pushed her off with an unexpected strength. He was getting up. She scrambled backward, away from the man who had nearly hunted her down like prey. Sierra's heart raced. She had to end this. Resolution as Reed lunged. She saw it. In his hand, he had pulled out a knife. The flash of steel was like a signal to her body to move. Sierra darted to the side, instinctively grabbing a broken beam from the shack's floor. The weapon felt heavier in her hands now, but she was ready to finish this. The two collided again, each trying to outlast the other. But Sierra was done running. She had already spent too many days fighting to survive, and this fight, it would be her final stand. With one final desperate strike, she hit Reed's hand. The knife fell from his fingers. She raised the beam high and brought it down, not to kill, but to make sure he couldn't hurt her anymore. Reed crumpled to the ground, bloodied, defeated, his eyes wild, but not with anger, fear. He knew. He had lost. She had survived. Sierra stood over him, breathing heavily, her legs trembling with exhaustion. She had won. She was alive. But as the fog began to lift, the weight of the forest settled into her bones. The fight had cost her everything, her strength, her spirit, but she had survived. She was still here. She looked around the abandoned shack one last time, knowing that it was over. She had faced death and won.